Hey folks, I know I'm just an old guy talking about some mysteries, but please leave a like and subscribe before we start. Let's enjoy in today's video. On July 20th, 1973, the world lost a titan. Bruce Lee was more than a movie star. He was a force of nature, a philosopher with fists of fury, a man who shattered cultural barriers with a single piercing ki. At just 32 years old, he had conquered Hollywood. He had conquered Hong Kong. He redefined the martial arts genre. He inspired millions. He was at the peak of his physical prowess, a specimen of human perfection who seemed utterly invincible. Yet, on that sweltering summer day in Hong Kong, the dragon fell silent. The news rippled across the globe like a devastating shockwave, leaving a trail of disbelief and heartache. Before he was a global icon, Bruce Lee was a child actor in Hong Kong. He was a restless spirit, brimming with charisma, born in San Francisco, but raised in Kowloon. But on the streets, he was a scrapper, finding his identity and purpose in the rough-and-tumble world of rooftop fights. This led him to the legendary IP man, the Wing Chun Grandmaster, who would hone the boy's raw energy into a disciplined fighting art. Lee absorbed the principles of Wing Chun, but his mind was too inquisitive, too rebellious, to be confined by a single style. He was already beginning to formulate his own philosophy, one that valued adaptation and effectiveness above all else. Sent back to America at 18 to claim his citizenship and escape trouble, Lee began to build his empire from the ground up. He taught martial arts in Seattle and Oakland, attracting students from all walks of life with his radical ideas. He rejected the rigid classical forms. Absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. This was the birth of Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. A philosophy as much as a fighting style, fluid, efficient, and brutally honest. His reputation grew, leading to his now legendary role as Kato in The Green Hornet, a part that introduced American audiences to his blinding speed and magnetic presence. Despite his scene-stealing performance, Hollywood wasn't ready for an Asian leading man. Frustrated by the stereotypical roles offered to him, Lee returned to Hong Kong in 1971, a move that would catapult him into superstardom. His first leading role in The Big Boss smashed box office records across Asia. He followed it with Fist of Fury and The Way of the Dragon. He wasn't just an actor, writer, director, and choreographer controlling every aspect of his cinematic vision. He was showing the world a new kind of hero, a proud, powerful Chinese man who stood up against injustice and oppression. By 1973, Bruce Lee was on the cusp of conquering the world. He had a groundbreaking co-production with Warner Brothers, Enter the Dragon, set for release. It was poised to be the film that would make him a household name in the West. The final day of Bruce Lee's life began with the same intensity that defined him. It was a hot, humid Friday in Hong Kong. Lee was focused on work. He had a lunch meeting with his business partner, Raymond Chow, the head of Golden Harvest Studios, to discuss their plans for Game of Death. Lee was a perfectionist, and every detail of the film mattered to him. He was animated and energetic, sketching out scene ideas and acting out fight sequences, his mind buzzing with the creative possibilities. There was no sign of illness, no hint of the tragedy that was only hours away. After the business meeting at his home, Lee was scheduled to have dinner with Chow and the Australian actor, George Lazenby. Lazenby was being considered for a major role in Game of Death. Before that, however, Lee made a stop that would become the focal point of the ensuing controversy. He went to the apartment of Betty Ting Pei, a Taiwanese actress, a close friend, slated to have a role in the film. They were meant to review the script together before meeting Chow and Lazenby for dinner later that evening. At her apartment, located at 67 Beacon Hill Road in Kowloon Tong, they talked work and relaxed for a few hours. Sometime in the late afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Lee complained of a headache. It was an ailment he had suffered from before, so it wasn't initially a cause for major alarm. Betty Ting Pei gave him a single tablet of Equagesic, a combination painkiller and muscle relaxant, that her own doctor had prescribed for her. It was a common, over-the-counter medication. After taking the pill, Lee said he wanted to lie down for a while. He went into her bedroom to rest before their dinner appointment. This was the last time anyone would see him conscious. Hours passed, and the world remained oblivious to the silent crisis unfolding in that quiet apartment. When Raymond Chow called Betty's apartment around 9 o'clock to find out why they were late for dinner, the nightmare began. Betty told him she couldn't wake Bruce up. At first, Chow was not overly concerned, perhaps thinking Lee was simply in a deep sleep after weeks of relentless work. But when he arrived at the apartment himself, and also failed to rouse the unconscious star, panic set in. They called a doctor who worked on Lee for 10 minutes, trying desperately to revive him. It was futile. Finally, an ambulance was called, but to avoid a media circus at Betty's home, they sent the ambulance not to the nearest hospital, but to the more distant Queen Elizabeth Hospital, where Lee was officially pronounced dead on arrival. The official investigation into Bruce Lee's death fell to the Hong Kong authorities, who were under immense pressure to provide a clear and definitive answer. The public was in shock. The press was in a frenzy. An autopsy was performed immediately, and the initial findings were puzzling. The forensic pathologists were led by Dr. R.D. Tier, a renowned expert flown in from London. They found no signs of external injury, no needle marks, no evidence of trauma, no indication of a violent struggle. His internal organs were healthy, with one critical exception, his brain. It was massively swollen, weighing 1,575 grams compared to an average of 1,400 grams. The cause of this severe cerebral edema, the swelling of the brain, became the central question. The toxicology reports came back with one significant finding: trace amounts of cannabis in his stomach and intestines. However, the levels were far too low to be considered a cause of death. The only other substance detected was the Equagesic tablet Betty Ting Pei had given him. Equagesic's active ingredients include aspirin and meprobamate, a tranquilizer. The coronial inquest concluded Lee had suffered a hypersensitive reaction to one or both of these ingredients, triggering an anaphylactic-like response that caused his brain to swell rapidly and fatally. The official cause of death was recorded as death by misadventure, a legal term indicating a death caused by a voluntary act that unexpectedly and unintentionally goes wrong. The coroner, Justice T.E. Chua, ruled the swelling was a rare allergic reaction. The swelling of the brain which caused the death of Bruce Lee was an idiosyncratic reaction to the contents of the tablet Equagesic. This verdict was meant to be the final word, a clinical, logical explanation for a deeply illogical event. It provided a neat, tidy answer that closed the case, at least on paper. However, this conclusion was not without its own set of questions. For one, Lee had taken Equagesic before, without any apparent ill effects. Why would he suddenly have a fatal reaction to a medication he had previously tolerated? 2 months earlier, on May 10, 1973, Lee had collapsed in a dubbing studio at Golden Harvest. He was suffering seizures and a severe headache and was rushed to the hospital. He was diagnosed with cerebral edema. Doctors treated him and saved his life, but they couldn't pinpoint the exact cause. The official inquest into his death largely dismissed this earlier episode as unrelated, a decision that many found difficult to accept. The death by misadventure verdict failed to satisfy a grieving public. For many, it was just inconceivable that the mighty Bruce Lee could be felled by something as mundane as a common headache pill. The circumstances of his death, in the apartment of an actress who was not his wife, created a fertile ground for suspicion. Initial attempts to conceal this fact only intensified doubts. The official story felt too clean, too convenient. This vacuum of belief was quickly filled with a host of alternative theories, ranging from the plausible to the outright fantastical, each one attempting to provide a more fitting end for a legendary figure. One of the most persistent theories points to the Hong Kong triads, claiming Lee had refused to pay protection money. The triads allegedly controlled the Hong Kong film industry. In retaliation, some say they had him assassinated. Others claim they placed a curse on him. Some versions suggest he was poisoned by a slow-acting substance that mimicked a natural ailment. Proponents argue the triads had the means, the motive, and the influence, and that a cover-up followed, pressuring witnesses and officials to stick to the official story. Another prominent theory involves the so-called death touch, dim mak, a legendary technique said to cause a delayed death days, or even weeks after a seemingly light blow. The theory says a rival martial arts master, jealous of Li's fame, angered by his willingness to teach ancient Chinese secrets to Westerners, challenged him to a secret duel. In this supposed fight, Li was struck with a dim mak blow. The May 10th collapse was the first sign of the technique taking effect, and his death on July 20th was its ultimate fulfillment. This theory, while lacking any concrete evidence, appeals to the mystique of the martial arts world that Li helped create. A more recent and scientifically grounded theory, proposed in a 2022 medical study, suggests the true cause was hyponatremia. Hyponatremia occurs when sodium in the blood is abnormally low, which can cause the brain to swell. The study argues Li had multiple risk factors, starting with a high fluid intake. He often spoke of drinking lots of water and of drinking juices as part of his regimen. The study also notes the use of cannabis, which can increase thirst, and the intense physical demands he placed on his body, which could have impaired his kidneys' ability to excrete excess water. In this scenario, the equagesic pill was merely incidental, not the primary cause of the fatal cerebral edema. The people closest to Bruce Li were left to navigate an impossible situation, grappling with their personal grief while being thrust into the center of a global media storm. His wife, Linda Lee Cadwell, presented a portrait of strength and dignity. In her initial statements and later in her book Bruce Lee, The Man Only I Knew, she largely supported the official narrative. She acknowledged Bruce's incredible drive and the immense stress he was under. He crammed so much into his 32 years that he had simply burned himself out, she would later reflect. Her focus was on preserving his memory as a husband, a father, a visionary. Raymond Chow, Li's business partner, was in a difficult position. His initial decision to obscure the fact that Li had died at Betty Ting Pei's apartment was a calculated move to protect reputations. In a public statement, Chow explained, "I was thinking primarily of Bruce's family, his wife Linda, and their 2 children, and secondly, of Betty's welfare." However, this concealment backfired, creating the impression of a cover-up. For years, Chow maintained the official cause of death, dismissing other theories as ridiculous nonsense. Betty Ting Pei, the woman at the center of the storm, saw her life and career irrevocably shattered. She was hounded by the press and vilified by a public that blamed her. In the decades that followed, she gave sporadic and sometimes contradictory interviews. She consistently maintained their relationship was platonic, and that she simply gave him a pill for a headache. "I was the only one there," she once said in a tearful interview, "but I have a clear conscience. I didn't do anything wrong." Her trauma and the public's refusal to let it rest have left her a tragic figure in the Bruce Lee saga. Other friends and colleagues offered different perspectives. Bob Wall, a fellow martial artist and co-star in Enter the Dragon, has been vocal that something else was at play. He has often pointed to Li's incredible physical condition and his previous, non-fatal reaction to painkillers as evidence. Similarly, George Lazenby, who was supposed to have dinner with Li that night, has expressed his own suspicions. These dissenting voices from within Li's circle have helped keep the mystery alive, suggesting that even those who knew him well were left with unsettling questions. The sense of mystery surrounding Bruce Li's death was tragically amplified 20 years later with the death of his son, Brandon Lee. In March 1993, while filming The Crow, Brandon was killed in a freak accident on set. A prop gun, which was supposed to fire a blank, had a dummy cartridge lodged in the barrel. When the blank was fired, it propelled the dummy cartridge out with the force of a live round, striking Brandon in the abdomen. He died in the hospital hours later at the age of 28. The eerie parallel, a rising star, on the cusp of greatness, cut down in his prime, was not lost on the public. This devastating coincidence gave rise to the theory of a Lee family curse. The narrative suggested that some dark force, either supernatural or generational, was targeting the men of the Lee family. Fans and conspiracy theorists drew lines connecting Bruce's father to Bruce's own untimely death, and finally to Brandon's shocking end. The idea of a curse provided a mythic framework for a series of incomprehensible tragedies. It was a way to make sense of the senseless, transforming random, cruel fate into a dark and compelling legend that fit the larger-than-life personas of both Bruce and Brandon. The curse theory often intertwines with other existing conspiracies. Some believe the curse was placed on the family by vengeful martial arts masters who felt Bruce had betrayed their secrets. Others link it back to the triads, suggesting that the hit on Bruce was part of a generational vendetta that was tragically fulfilled with Brandon's death. The details of Brandon's accident, a series of unlikely mistakes on a film set, were so bizarre that they seemed to defy simple explanation, making a conspiracy or a curse seem to some more plausible than sheer catastrophic negligence. While the Lee family, particularly Linda Lee Cadwell and her daughter Shannon, have never endorsed the idea of a curse, its power endures in popular culture. It speaks to a deep-seated human need for narrative and meaning in the face of chaos. The deaths of Bruce and Brandon Lee feel too poetic, too cinematic, to be mere accidents. The curse narrative, though rooted in superstition, provides a story with a beginning, a middle, and a tragic continuing arc. It ensures that the mystery of the Lee family is not just about a single event, but about a legacy seemingly shadowed by destiny, making their story all the more haunting and unforgettable. More than 50 years after his passing, Bruce Lee's flame has not dimmed. It has only grown brighter. His legacy transcends his films and his martial arts. He remains a global symbol of strength, self-expression, and the relentless pursuit of one's own potential. His philosophy of Jeet Kune Do has influenced countless martial artists and has been integrated into the very DNA of modern mixed martial arts. He was the father of MMA long before the sport had a name, a true visionary. Conor McGregor, Anderson Silva, and many others have cited him as an inspiration, not just for technique, but for a revolutionary mindset. His impact on cinema is equally profound. He shattered the glass ceiling for Asian actors in Hollywood. Jackie Chan, Jet Li, Michelle Yeoh, Enter the Dragon was not just a movie, it was a cultural event. It introduced the West to the power and grace of kung fu cinema on a massive scale. He brought a level of physicality, intensity, and philosophical depth to the action genre rarely matched. Quentin Tarantino, Ang Lee, and many others have paid homage to his work. He proved a hero could look like him, empowering generations who'd never seen themselves on screen. The enduring fascination with his death is linked to the power of his life. Bruce Lee cultivated an image of invincibility, the dragon. The official explanation, an allergic reaction to a painkiller, is tragically mundane. It doesn't fit the legend. People don't want to believe a force of nature could be extinguished by something so small. The mystery persists because we want it to. We seek a cause as grand as his life. Ultimately, the what if fuels his legacy. He died at the peak of his powers, leaving a small but flawless body of work and untapped potential. We wonder what masterpieces he would have made, how far he'd push film and philosophy. That unanswered question keeps him eternally young, powerful, and relevant. The mystery doesn't diminish his legacy, it sanctifies it, transforming him from man to myth, a timeless icon whose silence speaks as loudly as his battle cry. Until next time, keep exploring the unknown and come back for another Mystery of Humanity.